Chapter 1. There was an infinite number of things Kat would rather be doing tonight, and the options scrolled through her mind as she trailed behind Jake down Lexington, sitting on the couch in her apartment with a glass of wine and a movie. A dinner out with her best friend back home in Denver. A hot shower, a cold beer. A massage, a concert, the ballet. She'd even take something as typically unappealing as a few hours in a dentist chair right now. Short of terrible illness or injury, Kat couldn't think of anything much worse than attending a Halloween party hosted by the best friend of a guy she planned to break up with later. Kat and Jake had been together for only 3 months, so there was no real devastation involved, just exasperation. He was cute and funny and always happy enough to spend time with her, but he was oblivious in the way that so many guys were. He was willing to put in the effort, but only if she told him precisely what that effort entailed. A quiet night at Jake's apartment often found Kat squashed between a handful of guys on a shabby couch as they shouted at whatever basketball game was on the TV. If she suggested they do something, just the two of them, he'd take her out for sports trivia at a rowdy bar or a quick bite somewhere before heading back to his place for sex. Basketball and trivia and bars and sex were fine for now, but Kat had realized earlier, when Jake appeared at her doorstep, not in the agreed-upon shepherd's robe to match her stupid lamb costume, but dressed as his favorite Knicks player, that he mostly forgot about her the moment she left the room. The fact that they were still relative strangers wasn't really a surprise, but given that Jake was either unknowable or not very deep, he and Kat were likely going to remain strangers even if they stayed together for the next 50 years. So no, she wasn't upset about ending things. The sadness came whenever she considered that Jake, even barely knowing him, was still her closest friend here in New York. It was hard to make friends when most of your time was spent studying or in class, especially when the only free time you did have was monopolized by a beer-drinking, sports-watching, fine-for-now kind of guy like Jake. She only wished this realization would have occurred to her 3 months ago. Already a little buzzed from pre-gaming with his friends, Jake pushed open the front door to Harry's brownstone and walked in ahead of her. Tossing their coats on the couch, he clapped friends on the back and greeted a half-dozen people before it occurred to him that Kat knew nobody here except for Harry, messy, loud Harry, always with a nauseating string of spit connecting his upper and lower lip, and turned around to take her hand, dragging her through the room. Ellie, Nova, Ashley. Nice costume, girl. He dropped these names without offering hers in return. Everyone smiled, friendly but vague, and Kat did her best to connect faces to names, to give her bright, wide-open smile, but they were moving through the crowded room too fast for anything to stick. That guy over there is the other Jake. We call him Ohio Jake. Still walking, still a blur. Ting, Ava, that's Asher. Sophie, it's been fucking forever. In the kitchen, he tugged on Kat's hand again, leading her to a keg where he poured beer into a red plastic cup. Foam rose up and spilled over the lip as he distractedly handed it to her. Jake pressed a hard kiss to her cheek. "You good?" he asked. She frowned at him, understanding immediately he was going to pawn her off on someone. "I'm fine, but where are you?" Jake looked around quickly before settling his gaze on a woman dressed as a witch and bent at the waist while reaching for a can of wine in the refrigerator. "Regina," he said, bright with relief. The woman straightened, smiling in surprise and hugging Jake. "Regina, this is my girlfriend, Kat." Cracking the top on her wine, Regina turned her warm, dark eyes to Kat and smiled again. "Could you hang with her for a sec?" Jake asked. "I have to go find the boys." Before Regina could answer, he jogged out of the kitchen. Unsurprised, Kat watched him go and then turned her wry grin up to the other woman. "You don't have to babysit me. I promise I'm fine." Regina laughed and tilted her head for Kat to follow. "Jake is hopeless. Come on, there's a group of us over by the couch." From the side of the room, he watched the little lamb. He'd been unable to take his eyes off her, in fact, tracking her from the moment she was dragged in behind the basketball player. A truly aspirational costume, given that the man couldn't be more than 5'6", who deposited her unceremoniously in the kitchen with a woman she clearly had never met before. He stared at the lamb's face, enormous hazel eyes, sharp cheekbones, a mouth like a soft, edible heart, and then took in the rest of her. Brown curls fell past her shoulders. She was petite, but stood with a posture that spoke of a stubbornness and passion that made his skin hum. Feeding was endlessly more fun when they had a little fire in them. He watched as the costumed witch led the lamb to a sofa where several humans sat and gossiped. The lamb turned from him, and he stared at the firm swell of her backside in her white leggings. A flurry of debauched images raced through his mind before he pulled his gaze away. Stifling a yawn, he surveyed the party around him. Same shit, different setting. Forever 25, he easily blended in with the crowd here, but even if he hadn't, it wouldn't matter. Sometimes he wondered if people even saw his face or only reacted to the pull of his power. After all, he'd been there barely 10 minutes, but several women had approached him already, their eyes glazed in that familiar way, their offer simple and straightforward. He'd politely declined, compelling them to return to their friends, although he wasn't sure why. He needed to feed. It was the singular reason he'd left his penthouse, wandered uptown, and followed the group of unexceptional humans down the sidewalk, up the front steps, and into this dull party. He should get what he came here for and be done with it. And yet a familiar restlessness ate at him, made a tight, agitated sensation take seed in his gut and spread into his limbs. He was too impatient to spend hours slowly siphoning energy from the room, but he didn't want to take one of these dazed women into a dark bedroom for pleasure and feeding either. He wanted the same thing he'd wanted for centuries, to not have to live like this anymore. He knew that when he felt this way, the best thing was to run or swim or fly, but tonight he wanted something else more than he wanted relief from the tension of perpetual boredom or the urge to siphon from humans. Tonight, he simply didn't want to feel alone for a little while. He didn't lie to himself. Of course he was lonely. In this way, he supposed, sex served two purposes, companionship and sustenance, though of course for him companionship was a term to be used loosely. Centuries ago, when he'd been cursed and transformed, he quickly learned that a beat of eye contact was all it took. In a way, humans became drunk, not on fairy dust or pheromones or alcohol, but on the very essence of him, which turned their attraction or fascination into a raw, carnal hunger. From there, it was as simple as finding a private space, an apartment, a dark hallway, an alley, where he could pleasure them for as long as he wished and breathe in their vitality, until he was sated, and they were drowsy enough for him to vanish without notice. The unfortunate paradox, of course, was that no human in this state was very good company. Beguiled as they were by him, as soon as he was alone with a human, they were reduced to vacant, hypersexual beggars. The ensuing encounters sustained him, and certainly the sex itself was enjoyable, but it made the loneliness expand inside him into a dark, yawning pit. His eyes returned to the little lamb, shifting anxiously on her feet with the group of strangers chatting amiably around her. She lifted her gaze, searching the room, her eyes passing, unseeing, over where he stood. Despite his size, his tailored but nondescript black trousers and sweater, as well as centuries of experience, allowed him to blend into the shadows. And then her attention traveled the same path, but in reverse, and despite the absurd Halloween mask that covered half of his face, she saw him, her gaze clashing with his for a single, excruciating heartbeat, long enough for most humans to lose whatever trivial thought occupied their minds and move directly toward him. But strangely, the lamb's pulse didn't lurch, her lips didn't part in a gasp, her eyes didn't ignite and then glaze over. She simply blinked away, uninterested. Shock flooded him, and he was immediately, desperately curious. In a world where every second was predictable, the sensation of surprise was blissfully foreign to him. "Turn around," he murmured to her, using the low, vibrating voice that seemed to run down a human's spine, compelling them to unquestioningly do his bidding. For much of his existence, he'd used this power greedily to amass property and riches, to wordlessly coerce humans to dance and sing and make general fools of themselves to his great amusement. But in recent decades, he'd mostly used it to direct them away. The lamb frowned, turning her head to the side as if she'd sensed something behind her, someone speaking in her ear. But then, to his utter disbelief, she turned forward again. "Can you not hear me?" he said to her. If a heart still beat in his chest, it would be pounding in anticipation. "I said turn around, little lamb. Look at me." This time she did turn, confused and peering all the way over her shoulder to where he stood at the wall behind her. Their eyes met again, and her brow creased in confusion. Her expression spoke of uncertainty, thinking perhaps that she couldn't possibly have heard a man whispering to her from all the way across the room. When she tore her gaze from his, returning her attention to the group of humans before her, he pushed from the wall, his entire body vibrating with thrill. She'd heard his command but been unaffected by it. How? He needed to get her alone. He studied the other humans gathered in the living room. The man she'd come with had yet to return. What kind of idiot brought the most beautiful girl to a tawdry, cacophonous party like this and deserted her? If only he knew there were monsters out there, waiting for their turn. Chapter 2. The brownstone belonged to Harry's father, a man douchily named Royal, who Kat vaguely remembered Jake telling her was an asshole but seriously loaded. What Harry apparently lacked in parental love, he had in spades when it came to housing. Kat had moved to the city for graduate school only a few months ago, but she knew living here for even a decade, she'd be unlikely to meet another 20-something with a house like this all to himself. The party was on the ground floor, mostly contained to the common living spaces, but there were 3 levels to the place, and Kat was tempted to escape the party to explore them all. But first, a restroom. The one on the first floor was occupied, so she peeked into the empty bedrooms, ducking through the doorway of one with an en suite. With a sigh of relief, she crossed the room and closed the bathroom door behind her, sealing herself up inside. At the mirror, Kat studied her reflection and exhaled a slow, annoyed breath. When Jake suggested the coordinated costumes, his idea that she be the lamb to his shepherd struck her as vaguely patronizing and overtly patriarchal. Not to mention the unspoken expectation that she somehow managed to be a sexy lamb. But she'd agreed because, frankly, she was lazy about Halloween and happy for once to not be asked to be a sexy cat. That Jake hadn't even remembered the plan felt like salt rubbed into a paper cut. She wore all white leggings, white sneakers, and a fluffy, cropped white sweater. Her woolly hat had soft lamb ears, and she'd drawn a circle of black over the tip of her own nose. "You're dressed like a toddler," she told her reflection, swiping off the hat. She turned on the sink, washing the sticky, dried beer from the back of her hand before wiping the black makeup from her nose. Drying her hands and then leaning back against the counter, Kat ran through in her mind how and when she would end things tonight. She'd been the dumper and the dumped enough times to know that this breakup was unlikely to come as a surprise to Jake, but she still dreaded it, in part because there could be no brunch with girlfriends tomorrow to process it all. Everyone she knew and loved was hundreds of miles away. Can't I just text him? Her mind whined before deciding. Yes. A text was exactly the level of engagement this 3-month mistake deserved. Pulling out her phone, she typed the simple ending. "I don't think this is working. We have fun together, but I think friends only is the right vibe for us." She waited, staring at her phone, and in only a few seconds her text was decorated with the blandest of reactions. A thumbs up. To be fair, it's the correct reaction to a breakup text, she thought. With a laugh groan, she pushed off the counter and walked to the door, intending to put on her big girl lamb pants and return to the party, unwilling to let Jake be her only tether to other people. But the door to the hallway was no longer open. And when her eyes adjusted to the dark, she saw, too, that the room was no longer empty. A man, that man, tall as a tree and just as broad, leaned against the wall near the closed door, casually scrolling on his phone. He looked up when she stepped out, and from behind his ornate black-feathered mask, his eyes went wide in the way she knew hers had too, as if they'd each been caught doing something they weren't supposed to. Oh. She hooked a thumb behind her, saying the bathroom in the hall was occupied, just as he said, I needed a spot of quiet. His voice was low and rich, a melted confection, the words curled with a proper British accent. His clothes were all black, and something about him felt attractive, even though she couldn't make his features out in the darkness, behind his mask. Okay, good, she said, exhaling. So I haven't been caught sneaking around your room. His eyes drifted to the enormous blue and orange Knicks banner over the bed, and he uttered a sardonic no. Kat was stunned into silence when he stepped forward into a bit of streetlight slanting in through the window and lifted his mask. She revised her thought that he must be attractive. In fact, she'd never seen a more gorgeous person in her life. His features were severe and aristocratic, thick, dark brows, intense brown eyes, strong cheekbones and jaw, and a mouth she was positive was equally skilled at kissing and mockery. And then he smiled, becoming devastatingly more beautiful. Deep smile lines carved into his cheeks, his eyes lit with mischief, crinkling at the corners. Kat felt her rib cage shove a shaking breath out and suck another back in, hungrily. She couldn't tear her eyes away. Time stretched, and the walls of the room seemed to shrink down to a shoebox. A weight in her chest heaved forward, the desire to move toward him, but she fought it, frowning in concentration as her hands reached back and curled around the edge of the windowsill. He was frowning too, confused. Silence pulsed between them, a force compelling her forward, growing heavily in the air, and then she heard it, a soft yes, darling, stay there, in that deep, luxurious voice she swore she'd heard back in the living room, like an invisible man's voice had whispered directly into her ear. The tension snapped, freeing her to blink, to breathe, to retreat a step and feel the wood of the windowsill dig into the backs of her thighs. She shook her head. What did you say? She asked. He frowned, his what do you mean? Coming too slow, like a clunky lie. Awareness began at the base of Kat's spine. She didn't know how she was so certain, but she was. She'd been ensnared by him somehow, a fish lured in and caught on the end of a line before being released. The surreal question rose up her throat and stuck there. Did you do that to me? She was being ridiculous. She should head back to the party. Nothing, my mistake. He smiled warmly again, and the expression lit a small fire inside her. Happy Halloween, she added. He laughed, a sound so deep and intoxicating she felt it spreading like smoke through her bloodstream. Is it? He asked, smile turning wry. Kat felt the laugh rise out of her. Yeah, not really. He sent a hand into the pocket of his trousers and pulled in a deep breath that only seemed to heighten his hunger for this strange human. He discovered that she could hear the voice but wasn't commanded by it. She'd felt his allure, been tempted by it, but it hadn't made her mindless. He could taste her in the air, her lust like golden licks of flame all around her, but she'd kept her own mind. It had never happened, not once, in his entire immortal existence. I see you went all out with the costume, she joked, and on the heels of his wonder, his dead heart jerked to life for a phantom beat before he realized what she meant. He gazed down at the mask in his hand. Yes, well, it was a last-minute decision to come here. Are you a friend of Harry S.? Is he the host? He asked, looking back to her. The poor sod dressed as a block of cheese. She laughed, and it sent vibrations down his spine. Yes, that's Harry, but I think he's supposed to be a box of cereal. Shall I take that more seriously? Her laugh turned round and playful, and the sound absolutely delighted him. It was rolling, golden joy, a delighted uprising inside her. A flurry of images barraged him, his mouth on her stomach, nipping, tickling, licking that light from her skin, and he sucked in a breath, momentarily disoriented. Who are you here with? She asked. Only myself. She frowned, that heart-shaped mouth turning into a pout he wanted to devour. Then who do you know here? She pressed. I don't know anyone, he admitted, knowing how stiff and awkward he must seem, so unaccustomed he was to conversation. Who accompanied you? Accompanied, she laughed again, my newly ex-boyfriend. Newly, cheers, I'm glad to hear it. You are wise. He could tell she found him odd and dug around in his thoughts, searching for the words. Already, it was the longest conversation he'd had with a human in decades, and the skill felt rusty and slow in his mind. Because he looked like a bloody fool dragging you through a party and abandoning you immediately. Her eyes turned guarded. He looked like a fool. Do you think it's appropriate for a man to treat a woman that way? No, but if anyone looked like a fool back there, it was me. For being with him? He leaned forward, wanting to understand. For so long, he hadn't bothered to care about human feelings and motivations beyond what he needed from them. He felt, at once, like he was learning a new language. She parroted his words back to him, for letting him drag me through a party and abandon me immediately. Did you really let him? You seemed rather taken aback. And you seem to have been paying very close attention. Her voice had a thin film of unease. You're beautiful, little lamb. Everyone in that room noticed you. He smiled. I'd wager everyone in any room notices you. She turned her gaze from his then, behind him to the door, and he had to shove down the instinct to command it back, suspecting it wouldn't work. Her hazel eyes were like glimmering amber. Her focus made him ravenous. He wanted her with a keening drive that felt like a twin heartbeat just beneath his skin, but the novelty of conversing with her was too hard to give up. Why did you stay? He asked. Why not just leave the party? I don't know, she admitted. It feels rude somehow. Ruder than walking into poor Harry's bedroom uninvited, he teased. Ruder than crashing someone's party you don't even know, she parried back. He laughed. Touché. She studied him, tilting her head. This party seems like a weird fit with. She gestured a hand down the length of his body. Your whole vibe. Frowning, he asked, my vibe? The lamb lifted her hands daintily, mimicking a cup and saucer, and pretended to take a sip of tea. Are you accusing me of being posh? He asked, grinning. Her British accent was both terrible and charming. Quite right. Fancy a turn around the room. He gave a wary glance around. I'd be afraid of what the serial blokes got shoved behind his dresser. Fair, her smile straightened, and he dug around in his thoughts for something to keep her talking. She beat him to it. Who are you? My name is Briggan. He stilled after he said it, his smile evaporating. Why had he said it? Briggan hadn't told a human his real name in centuries. The closest he'd gotten to even speaking it had been words like twig or rig, which had always felt like a familiar echo on his tongue. It had been Michael, Edgar, George, Louis. He'd rotated through a handful of names for decades. The old driver's license in his wallet said Samuel James Miller, an identity he would soon need to abandon because the date of birth printed there was 1943, and at least until the curse was broken. Briggan would forever look 25, not 81. But right now, here with her, it hadn't even occurred to him to prevaricate. But she, of course, was unaware of his shock. Why did you come in here? She asked. Honesty slipped free. I followed you. At this, she stiffened, pressing back into the window, and he shook his head. I've scared you, I'm sorry. He stepped to the side, giving her a clear path to the door, and reached back to open it. I'm not trapping you in here. I'm not here to hurt you. Her brow creased. What did you just say? I said I'm not trapping you in here. No, after that. He shook his head, shocked again that she could hear the voice, but that it didn't reach that obedient, instinctive part of her. I don't. So I'm imagining it, she asked, frustrated. Why did you follow me in here? Briggan took in her guarded expression, her tense posture, but also the blazing frankness in her eyes, the steady angle of her jaw. How honest do you want me to be? He asked. Completely. I followed you in here because you looked lonely. I followed you in here because you're beautiful, and I like beautiful things. A pause, and then the rest slipped out of him. I followed you in here because I'm lonely too. Her jaw worked, and she cut her gaze from his again, staring behind him to the door he'd left slightly ajar. She was considering leaving. She should leave, and he would let her, of course. Naturally, with the cursed allure that had humans hurling themselves at him, the nameless woman who entered a trance and crossed a room to offer herself to him, the man who sidled up to him on the subway, the woman who turned at first glimpse to follow him on the street. Consent was murky at best. But with every cursed cell in his body, Briggan wanted the little lamb to voluntarily stay. He registered that he wanted her in a way he hadn't wanted anyone since before, when his human body had ached for connection and touch and relief, not merely sustenance. Sex had lost its meaning, becoming synonymous with feeding, but now the word whispered through him, sibilant and seductive, turning his muscles taut. Everything about this human, the inquisitive tilt of her head, the angle of her wary smile, the clarity in her eyes, suggested to him that sex with her could be different. That it wouldn't only be pleasure rolling off her in waves for him to consume, it might be pleasure uncorked for him too. "What's your name, little lamb?" She chewed her lip and then said, "Catalina." The rational part of Kat's mind wondered what the hell she was doing, why she hadn't bolted the second he admitted he'd followed her in here, the second he'd opened the door, stepping aside for her to escape. All of this was something out of a podcast, a newspaper article, a story where everyone already knows the ending, that has the audience yelling at her to leave immediately. But even though Briggan was clearly other, and she didn't know exactly what that meant quite yet, her pulse wasn't a panicky staccato. She felt curiosity, not fear. He was tall, enormous, really. She could only guess he was well over 6 feet, towering over her even from where he stood on the other side of the bed. She wished she'd seen him enter the room to know whether he'd had to angle his body to get through without his astounding costume wings colliding with the doorframe. She caught a glimpse of his hands before he'd tucked them into the pockets of his expensive pants, and they'd been huge. By any measure of logic, Kat should have been afraid of him. But somehow, she was. Not even when she'd surfaced from the thrall she'd felt when she first saw his face, not even when he spoke in that low, hypnotic voice. It was his eyes, maybe, how they sparkled with light even in the shadows, or how they held a mischievous smile even when his mouth straightened. Maybe it was the mix of innocence and wisdom in his face, the hunger and sadness, his gaze somehow both young and old, although he couldn't have been much older than she was. Or maybe it was the boyish way his thick, dark hair fell over his forehead, and how right now he seemed to be sweetly looking up at her, even from above. Strangely, Kat felt like she knew him. There was something so familiar about Briggan, so much so that when he'd told her his name, she'd almost answered, "Right, I forgot." Maybe she did know him, in a past life, or in dreams, or in something else that seemed impossible but true at the same time. Kat had always been fascinated by the paranormal. She was never afraid of the dark, never worried about monsters under her bed. She happily took a dare to spend the night in a haunted house in high school and knew the most dangerous things for her were other humans. And even though the thought rang in her head like a bell, "Briggan is different, Kat, pay attention," she'd never felt such a disorienting mix of lust and curiosity and attraction and protectiveness before. Her instincts solidified like a steel frame inside her, and so she stayed put, her back to the window, and said softly, "Close the door again." For a beat, he looked surprised, and she clarified, "I don't feel like dealing with them if Jake or Harry were to walk by right now." With a small smile, Briggan obliged, turning to softly shut them in the room together. The words rose up and out of her, "Come closer." He pushed off the wall, walking slowly to her and stopping barely a foot away. Kat didn't know how it was possible that he smelled like fresh air winding through a forest, but she had to resist leaning forward and taking a deep, greedy breath. He stared gently down at her, those eyes bright even in the shadows. He really did dwarf her. Her gaze was level with the solid expanse of his chest. "And now?" he asked. She felt the way a silent, seductive tether kept tugging at her mind, beguiling her, and her awareness of it hovered to the side, as if observing. Kat reached forward, setting her hand on his stomach. It jerked under her touch, his breath sucking in sharply, and when she glanced up at his face, an expression of disoriented wonder widened his eyes. Her fingertips felt the solid lines of his body, wandering up over his pectorals, his sternum, and she traced a single finger up the length of his throat, over his chin, and drew the shape of his mouth as it turned up into a smile. "Are you seducing me, little lamb?" "SHH," she whispered, smiling, enchanted again, but this time she didn't try to shake the tether off. She knew where this was going. She wanted him, and he wanted her to want him, and it didn't matter where her desire ended and his invisible persuasion began. Wanting him didn't scare her, didn't feel impulsive or shameful or dangerous. It simply felt inevitable. Chapter 3. Briggen didn't know how much of this was his powerful allure and how much was Catalina's actual desire, and he couldn't slow his mind long enough to parse it out. It didn't matter. Thrill haloed her skin, a honeyed, golden glow that felt like euphoria and tasted and smelled like spun sugar on his tongue, in his nostrils. Her hands were hot and brazen, fingers tracing his features, running through his hair, sliding back along his neck and across his collarbones, down to measure the length of his arms, lifting his hand to examine it with her fingertips. When was the last time he'd been touched like this? With patient mapping and fascinated caresses. His skin felt too tight. His body was ravenous for her, but he hadn't so much as kissed her yet and would never in 1,000 years rush it. Her touch, the intention there, her patient fascination, the way she glowed brighter to him the more her hands roamed, was a balm to the tattered ruin of his heart. Briggen couldn't remember a lover who hadn't mindlessly devoured whatever he gave them and then greedily demanded more. He reeled in understanding when it hit him, for it had been so long. This was what real desire looked like. Her hand came up to the back of his neck then, coaxing him down, and he finally lifted his arms, sending them around her back and pulling her body into his. Catalina melted against him, letting out a sweetly petulant growl of hunger as he withheld the kiss, his mouth hovering only a breath away. "We might not have time to do everything I'd like to do to you," he said. "Then just do the most important things," she teased, and as she spoke, her breath brushed over his lips. Briggen felt the spiraling dizziness of desire invade his limbs. "Are you sure you want this?" "Yes." He bent, exhaling into her neck, doing everything he could to force the allure down, desperate for once to know the truth. "Answer honestly, Catalina. Do you want this?" She pushed back to meet his eyes, frowning up at him in confusion. "I was being honest." Relief and longing rushed through him, and he fit his mouth to hers. Her lips immediately responded, soft, warm, and sweetly wet. A kiss, just a simple kiss, unlike anything he'd had since before. The slide of their mouths together, the playful slotting and tugging of lips and teeth. Briggen groaned, unable to resist deepening the contact, feeling the small, teasing slip of her tongue over his, the tight fist of her hand in his hair as she sent the other down between their bodies and over the stealing length of him. She gasped, sucking his breath from his mouth, and at the sight of her golden desire rolling in waves from her skin, instinct took over. "Shoes off," he commanded silently, and surprisingly compliant, she kicked her shoes to the side. He wondered at it, whether the loosening of her mind with desire let him in somehow, made her malleable to his murmured commands. Briggen's hands slid up under her sweater, hands finding velvet skin and small curves and the wildly sensitive peaks of her breasts that he stroked and pinched and teased, until she kissed him with an intent and hunger that made him savage. He pulled the sweater off and dropped it at her feet, flicked her bra free, and bent to suck at her breasts as his hands dug into her leggings and underwear, coaxing them down and off. Briggen almost felt guilty for feeding, for siphoning the honeyed radiance from her skin, as if tonight wasn't about that, But how was he meant to resist? He was accustomed to seeing desire as a pale glow, shimmering cream, the occasional soft yellow. But Catalina's pleasure was unlike anything he'd ever seen, emanating from her in pulsing, golden waves. For so long, it had seemed only a cruel joke that he was cursed to feed off the joy and pleasure of humans when he couldn't find joy and pleasure himself. But this was bliss. And Briggan didn't have to worry about draining her, leaving her weak or unconscious. Her vitality was more than he could possibly consume, and even when he'd sated his hunger, he was far from satisfied, kissing his way down her body. Kneeling before her, Briggan pressed his mouth to the petal-soft skin of her stomach. Wet, he commanded inaudibly as he always did with lovers, but then added, soaking wet, unable to resist more of everything with Catalina. Her back arched, a low moan escaping her throat as her body obeyed. He felt need like a hammer pounding beneath his skin and all along his length, but allowed himself the indulgence of a taste, coaxing one leg over his shoulder, leaning in for a kiss, a lick, and then giving in another and another until he was feasting on her in earnest, lost in the feel of her on his tongue, the sensation of plummeting into infatuation. Catalina moved against him, both hands in his hair, her head thrown back, throat exposed. Looking up the length of her naked body, he imagined being a different kind of monster, one who would sink his teeth into that neck, or her thigh, or better yet, this delicate and fevered skin beneath his lips. He could feel her pulse on his tongue, could sense the pitch of her need rising, golden light rippling from her, and for the first time in his existence, he understood the instinct to draw blood, to drink it. Briggan felt barely in control. Just as her sounds grew tight and frantic, he stood and with a rare desperation, fumbled for his belt, his button, his zipper, freeing himself. Lifting her, he stepped forward, and in one thrust he was inside, the feel of her stunning his senses so thoroughly that for a moment all he could do was lean against her, pinning her to the wall. Without leverage, she writhed against him, begging with her body and her sounds, and finally her voice so close. "Briggan, please." The sound of his name, whispered into his ear while he was inside her and her scent and taste still clung to his senses, caused him to thrust forward on instinct, and he pushed deeper still before retreating, eliciting a sharp, euphoric cry from her throat. Again and again, he moved hard fast, as if chasing his sanity, thinking that relief from this new and terrifying desperation must be only just ahead, needing the release to come back to himself, to his reason, for he was momentarily convinced that even when he inevitably climaxed, it wouldn't sate him. Catalina's breaths grew tight and fast. She begged for more of him, and when he gave it, she came, and then came again and again. He knew with every passing second that the chances of someone happening upon them increased, grew almost certain. But Briggan couldn't let himself find his own release because it was already too perfect, too unbelievable, and once he finished, then what would become of him? How would he find satisfaction with anything less than this? Madness, he thought to himself. This is what madness feels like, to want to exist in a moment that isn't reality. And what a relief it was to know that he couldn't fall in love with her, was incapable of it, because if this was a fraction of love, he would never be able to let her out of his sight. She cupped his face, bringing his mouth to hers, and kissed him, deep and defenseless, whispering, "You're going to ruin me for anyone else." He closed his eyes, his silent heart echoing the same fear. And when she pressed her lips to the shell of his ear and whispered, "Come for me, Briggan," he did. Briggan set Cat down on shaking, weak legs. Pleasure still reverberated through her body, the rumbling moan he'd given when he'd climaxed still echoed in her mind. With his hands lingering on her hips, he waited until she got her bearings before stepping back. She felt the way he watched her steadily, his dark eyes guarded. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "You're not tired." Cat nodded and then shook her head, unable to find words but unsure which question to answer. She felt euphoric, dazed, wholly worshipped. "You can lie down on the bed if you need to rest," he said, his voice carrying an edge of confusion. she shook her head again. I'm not tired. In truth, she couldn't imagine sleep right now, what he'd just done to her. She wasn't sure she had the words to describe it. She had never been with a man this strong, had never been with a lover this attuned to her pleasure. It had been hard and wild and frantic, but it had also been joyful and intimate, like opening a door to a secret world. To his secret world. Infatuated, Kat looked up at his face, but his gaze avoided hers as he zipped up his pants. She felt the full extent of her nudity but didn't bother to hide. Are you all right? She asked, and he nodded, but she had the sense that he was lying. Briggan, look at me. Finally, he lifted his eyes to hers, but slowly, dragging his focus from her hips up over her stomach, her breasts, her throat, her mouth. I'm not going to see you again, am I? She asked, her stomach falling in realization. Hesitating, he shook his head. Why? His eyes shuddered, the playful light extinguishing. Because, little lamb, it doesn't work that way. Briggan bent, collecting her clothes for her and wordlessly helping her back into them. Her underwear and bra, which he fastened for her. He held her leggings as she stepped into them one foot after the other and eased them up her legs and over her hips. He angled her sweater over her head and guided each arm inside before sliding it down her body, looking as miserable as she felt. Finally, he tugged her cap over her head and tidied her hair over her shoulders. Am I presentable? She asked, forcing levity into her voice and smiling up at him. The idea of not seeing him again made her unbearably sad. No one would look at you and have the faintest idea what we've been up to. I'm not sure that's true, she said. It smells like sex in here. He took a long, slow inhale. That it does, my darling. Briggan bent, resting his lips over hers for a long, soft beat. But when she opened her eyes, he was gone. Chapter 4. Suddenly alone in the dim room, Kat startled, whipping her head to the left and then the right. What just happened? Where the hell did he go? She pushed away from the wall, turning in a half circle, trying not to panic because, with Briggan's departure, the room had gone cold and empty. All trace of his scent and the weight of sex in the air was gone. Her skin felt cool, her pulse no longer a thundering presence deep in her belly, between her legs. It was like he'd never been there. Had she hallucinated everything? Had anyone actually been in here with her? Terrified for a beat that she'd either lost her mind or had somehow just had sex with a fucking ghost. Kat bolted from the room, ignoring Harry's drunken shout of apology when they clipped shoulders in the hall, ignoring Jake's voice calling to her from across the living room. She grabbed her coat from the pile on the couch near the door and yanked it on, rushing out and pulling up short as the front door slammed at her back. She stared down the front steps where Briggan stood, in all his impossible glory, carefully arranging himself into a dark overcoat. She pulled in a deep breath of relief. He was not a ghost. But staring down at him in the streetlight, she could easily confirm that he wasn't simply a man either. How did you do that? Startled, Briggan turned at the sound of her voice. Humans never snuck up on him, particularly unthinkable after sex, and especially not door-slamming, foot-stomping humans that smelled like sugar and lust in him. But his mind was an absolute mess, and so here she was, Catalina on the front stoop, bundled in her coat and sheep's cap, cheeks still flushed, lips swollen. She was so beautiful it made him ache. Do what? He asked as evenly as he could. Back there. What did you do to me? Briggan forced himself to appear unaffected, grinning seductively at her. Everything you asked, and then some. Catalina scowled. You know what I mean. He did know. He knew because he felt the same disorientation she felt. He'd never had sex like that with a human, and never left a human in a state other than sleeping peacefully, temporarily drained of energy. Not only was she awake and alert, but she'd also been sweetly ravaged and sated, smelling like him, warm with continued longing. Leaving Catalina in that room had been nearly impossible. I believe I asked for your consent, he hedged, and you obliged. I'm not saying, she cut the words off, exhaling a small cloud of air that quickly turned opaque in the cold air. Yes, I wanted to do what we did, but... But I've never wanted to have sex with a stranger before, and with you, it was more than that. You didn't feel like a stranger, and she was flustered, and he had to fight the urge to walk up the steps to her. I just want to understand. Brigham let his gaze sweep over her in the porch light. The shiny, dark curls spilling out beneath her cap, those enormous hazel eyes and full heart-shaped mouth, the strong angle of her jaw and cheekbones, the graceful line of her neck, the perfect breasts he'd had his hands and mouth all over not 10 minutes ago. He felt suddenly and disorientingly ashamed of their experience in the bedroom inside that hovel of a brownstone. The sex had been transcendent, but it was still only rutting against a wall like animals. He would have liked to have peeled her clothing away an article at a time and laid her bare, sipping lazily at her amber glow as he pleasured her for hour upon hour. For a moment, Brigham imagined taking her in a bed, slow and patient and teasing. He imagined watching her sleep, feeling her wake up in his arms. He inhaled sharply, pulling himself away from the fantasy. Understand what, Catalina? If he were to be honest with himself, he wanted to understand too. Wanted to know why he was so deeply drawn to this human if she wasn't the curse breaker, and how could she be if she didn't see what he needed her to see? After all, Brigham knew Catalina would have said something if she saw him fully. She wouldn't be able to resist remarking upon it. So, what was this then? Just another one of the sorceress's twists of the knife, making him want connection with someone who couldn't break the curse, who would still grow old and die in a blink of his eye. There's something different about you, she said. He fought a grin despite himself. I'd hope so. She searched his eyes. What are you? Brigham stilled, not who but what. He rocked back on his heels, swallowing his shock, and raised an eyebrow. That's an odd question, Catalina. But the right one, she said steadily. He felt his nostrils flare, but tucked away any other reaction to this. We barely know each other, she continued. But did it feel like sex with a stranger to you? Brigham swallowed, hating that the truth slipped so easily free. No, it did not. How did you know how to make me? Orgasm, he said low and quiet, her cheeks darkened. Yes, so fast, so many times. You were delightfully vocal in communicating your needs. It's different, she said. You're different. No man has ever paid attention to what I want the way you have. A shame, Catalina. Yes, but it's more than that. You paid attention, but it was almost as if she exhaled a confused breath. You got into my head. He tried to laugh this off. You're suggesting I'm a mind reader. Don't pretend like you don't know what I mean. Brigham pulled in a deep breath, but it was a mistake. He could smell his sex on her above her soft, sugared perfume, and it made his blood heat all over again. Feigning boredom, he murmured, "This conversation is a little pointless, isn't it?" Except it wasn't, not at all. She lifted her chin. I'm not leaving until you tell me what you are. Chapter 5. Kat shivered on the stoop. Behind her, the party roared loud enough to be heard through the thick oak door, the laughter and music an odd contrast to the intensity of her eye contact with Brigham. You're cold, he noted, voice low. She barely noticed and waved this off. It's fine. His dark eyes lost their glimmer, and his words took on a protective growl when he murmured, It isn't fine. Then tell me what you are, and I'll go back inside. Back inside to that blockhead ex-boyfriend. A tiny thrill wormed through her at the flash of his jealousy. I just had multi-orgasmic sex with you, she said, shaking her head in exasperation. I'm not going to go back in there to the worst lay of my life. Brigham seemed to fight the laugh, but it lit his eyes, crinkling the corners, and something eased in her chest. He blew out a breath. Catalina, you'll forget about me. Wow, thank you, she exhaled a sarcastic laugh. It's better that way. For who? For you, of course. I'm not what you want or need, believe me. What I want or need is my call, not yours. You are stubborn, little lamb. Maybe so, But you're the one who criticized Jake for leaving me as soon as we got to the party. And now that you've fucked me, you're going to leave me alone on the doorstep." Briggan fell silent at this, his expression blanking. He looked to the side, his profile sharp and perfect in the streetlight, jaw tight. It was several long seconds before he inhaled and then blew out a long breath as if he was finally, exhaustedly, giving in to something. He turned back to her. "All right, then. Do you fancy a pint?" Confusion wiped the scowl from her face. "What?" "You're cold, and I'd rather not linger out here on the street. Let's walk to the small pub on the corner. I'll buy you a pint. And I'll promise to answer 5 questions if you'll promise to leave me alone afterwards." "If I promise to leave you alone, I can ask you anything and you'll answer." He nodded slowly. "Only if the same goes for me." "You get 5 questions, you mean?" He nodded again. "You must answer honestly, and then I, too, will leave you alone." "The thing is," she said quietly, "I think you could make me answer honestly." After a surprised beat, Briggan laughed, the sound like a flood of joy from deep in his belly. "I won't compel you," he said. "Not that it seems to work anyway." Kat went still. "Is that what you call it, compelling? Is that one of your questions?" She stared up at him, calculating. "I don't think so, not yet." "So are we in agreement? A pint, 5 questions each, full honesty, and then you pretend we've never met." The tension to understand him felt like a physical rod inside her torso, something rigid and pulsing. She wasn't sure that 5 questions would ease it, and she hated the idea of never seeing him again, but it was that or nothing. She could see it in his eyes. He wanted her to say yes, but the second she said no, he would vanish again, and this time for good. "Okay," she said. His black eyes glimmered, and he smiled that beautifully dimpled smile. "Yeah, all right, cheers." He held out his arm to her. "Shall we?" Chapter 6. If sex with some sort of magical creature at a crowded party wasn't surreal enough, then sitting across from him afterward at a small booth at King's Ale House, having a drink, certainly was. Kat could barely blink as she watched him lift his glass of scotch and bring the rich amber liquid to his lips. He sipped it, let out a happy ah, and swallowed. "Shall I start, or would you rather?" he asked, wiping the pad of his thumb across his mouth. His hand fell away, revealing that amazing smile, and he laughed at her stunned silence. "Is it really so hard to look at me?" It was, actually. She'd seen him in the dark bedroom, she'd seen him in the shadows of the porch light. But she hadn't seen him under the warm lighting of a bar, and she didn't even feel embarrassed about the time it was taking her to get used to being this close to someone so expansive, so massive, so beautiful. His skin was smooth and unmarred, every feature in perfect dimension and proportion. Those black eyes held a constellation of mirth and teasing and fondness. His mouth, that sinful mouth, was full and smiling, teeth straight and white and perfect. But there was something else there in his eyes. Loneliness, anguish, a haunted tightness she couldn't identify. Kat gnawed at a hangnail, wondering where to begin, and a shimmer ran through her. Starting, she registered he'd said something in that low, vibrating voice. "What?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "I told you to stop eating your hand." She huffed out a laugh, tucking it in her lap under the table. "How are you able to ignore it?" he asked bluntly, and although to anyone else the question would be vague and nonsensical, Kat felt vindicated that he was finally acknowledging the voice he used. "I've never met anyone who could," he explained. "I can hear it," she said, thinking back to the low hum of Briggan's voice in Harry's living room and in the bedroom, both times sounding as if it was coming from every direction at once. "But it's almost like a voice coming from another room, on every side of the one I'm in. Quiet, deep, vibrating. What do you feel when I speak in that voice?" "The same thing I feel when I look at you." "Which is?" Kat thought about it more, feeling now how the desire to move to the other side of the booth, to slide in beside him, was nearly irresistible. But also that it was curiosity above fear, only a desire for him to come closer. warm and relaxed. So it doesn't scare you. She shook her head. When we were, she trailed off, blushing. Enjoying each other, he prompted with a grin. Yes, during that, I let you in and it made everything better. She nodded, blowing out a breath. Yes, so much better. Briggan sat back in the booth, smiling. Fascinating. With a deep breath, Kat leaned forward, planting her elbows on the table. Oh, he teased, eyes twinkling. She's getting settled in. He mirrored her posture, leaning forward again, resting his forearms on the table. Shall we begin? Begin, she asked, laughing. You've already asked me 4 questions. He grinned, shaking his head. We hadn't officially started yet. Those don't count. With a soft growl, she relented. Fine, first question, she said pointedly. How old are you? He looked surprised. Obviously, this wasn't where he expected her to start. 25. And she'd expected him to be honest. Yes, but how long have you been 25? Briggan grinned, saying cheekily, a while. A laugh burst out of Kat's throat. Is this your way of admitting to me that you've read Twilight? How could I resist? Vampires and werewolves. I had to know if my friends were portrayed accurately. Kat narrowed her eyes at him. Come on. He waved a casual hand. Truthfully, it was pretty inaccurate. No vampire is all that good-looking. They're hideous. That's what's inaccurate, she said, laughing. Not the sparkling or superpowers. Why would the superpowers surprise you? He asked slyly. Yes, okay, good point. Kat held up 2 fingers. Second question, what are your powers? Briggan lifted his glass, taking a sip of his drink. She watched him sit it on his tongue for a beat before he swallowed, his throat moving seductively. I have a few, he said, drawing her attention back to his face. Nothing like mind reading or premonition, but the voice, as you've noticed. Also strength, speed, stealth, I have those. A furrow flickered across his brow. For example, I vanished from the room as you registered, though it was through the door, quite ordinary. I'm simply fast and quiet, and most women are exhausted and a bit cloudy after sex, left only with the sense of being perfectly sated. Never has a lover chased me out onto the street. He chuckled, swirling his drink, ice cube clinking against the heavy glass tumbler. The attraction is also a power, she said, not a question, and Briggan grimaced as if, to him, this gift was tedious. Humans are drawn to me, he said simply. It's quite embarrassing to say it aloud, but my simple existence is a seduction. That's what I call the allure. Do you use the voice on humans all the time? She laughed at his quirked brow. Come on, you got 4 free questions when we first sat down. Briggan scowled playfully at her, but he didn't argue. He took another sip of his drink, frowning as he swallowed, and she had the sense that he rarely, if ever, spoke about this. Well, yes, I can use it to make humans do what I want. He leaned forward again, slowly spinning the glass on the coaster. Except with you? I could compel you once you'd let me in, but not entirely. She stared at him, silently willing him to tell her more without making her burn a question to ask. Curiosity was a roaring fire in her chest. But this time, she relented before he did. Okay, fine. Question 3. What have you tried to compel me to do? I tried to make you relax in the bedroom back at the apartment, and you did, but not fully. Once we were clearly going to be intimate, I told you to take your shoes off. She smiled at this, and then he added, and I instructed your body to be wet for me so that I could take you easily. Kat felt herself go completely still as heat engulfed her skin. Ah, he murmured, his heated gaze sweeping over her face, and a hum filled her head. Her body felt warm and liquid. That's my sweet lamb. Sucking in a deep breath, Briggan tore his focus away as if it were a struggle. Kat stared at him, fascinated. Try it again now. Briggan returned his eyes to hers. What? Try to compel you. She nodded, and then she saw his lips move, heard a noise that was more vibration than sound, and felt a tickling urge in her palm, her index finger, her arm, but she resisted the pull, and it slowly fizzled out. She frowned at him. "What did you tell me to do?" "Pick your nose." Cat barked a horrified laugh. "Shut up." "Very well," he mimed, zipping his mouth closed. "No, no, don't shut up, just, oh my God. If that had worked, I would have poured this drink over your head." Briggan laughed as she picked up her beer and smiled at him over the top. She wanted to ask for this night to go on forever. "All right, your turn to ask some now," she said. "I'm saving my last two." The only question Briggan needed to ask Catalina was right there at the tip of his thoughts, but he already knew the words wouldn't form on his tongue, no sound would emerge. He'd tried to ask it before, of course he had, over the span of nearly 9 centuries. "Do you notice anything different about me? Do you see anything?" But he'd learned long ago that the ability to ask a human whether they saw what he desperately wanted them to see was impossible. It was a curse for a reason. So he asked the next most important thing instead. "You are beautiful and funny and kind. Why on earth are you lonely?" Catalina's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly tucked it away. "I moved here a few months ago for graduate school. It's an amazing city," she said, "and I love my program. I'm studying environmental ethics. But it's hard to meet people. Jake is in my program, and turns out he's the most inattentive and clueless guy I've ever dated, but he's the only person I've gotten to know at all so far. I'm close to my parents and my brother. I have good friends back in Denver." She shrugged. "If I'm lonely, it's because I really miss home." He studied her as she lifted her beer and took a sip. For a beat, she stared down into her glass, and when she looked back up, her gaze was suddenly wary, as if something had just occurred to her. "You don't tell people about yourself very often, do you?" He shook his head. "Never in my existence." She swallowed, holding his gaze. "You're not going to kill me, are you?" Briggan wanted to laugh at this, to wave it off as absurd, but there was a growing kernel of awareness at the back of his mind that urged him to do exactly that. He'd told Catalina too much already, and even as infatuated as he was with this soft, rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed little lamb, he should probably kill her anyway. "I haven't decided," he said, trying to joke, but feeling the way the words burned at the back of his throat. She gave a trembling smile as she swallowed again, cupping her hands around her glass. "I knew immediately that you weren't like other men. I guess that answer doesn't surprise me." "You won't argue for your life?" he asked, smiling. She grinned at him. "Is that an official question?" "Yes, it's my second one. If you really thought that was my plan, you wouldn't try to convince me to let you live." Catalina tilted her head. "No, because I don't believe you'd kill me." "Why not?" "I just don't," she shrugged. "My turn." Briggan nodded, and he felt the way her heart gave a heavy, anxious thump before she said, "You already know what my fourth question is." "I do," he said, "but I want to hear you ask it anyway." She pulled her lips between her teeth, drawing in a deep, steadying breath. "What exactly are you? I mean, what do you call your kind?" Briggan laughed. "I can't believe I'm actually saying all of this aloud." Catalina lifted her hands, dragging them down her face. "What am I?" He'd never been given a name, although some aspects of his form were obvious, at least to him. Naturally, in the course of this unending existence, he'd stumbled upon others. Only a few. He didn't know where the term had come from, whether another one of his kind had made it up, or whether it had been proclaimed by some celestial being he hoped to someday meet. "I am a fallen," he said, and lifted the scotch to his lips, letting the heat of the liquid coat them. "I am one of a handful like this." "Fallen like an angel?" she asked very, very quietly. "I suppose." Briggan nodded slowly, carefully, waiting for the curse to tighten around his vocal cords, keep him from veering too close to describing himself, asking her what she saw to make her guess that word so specifically. "I was very naughty, a very long time ago, and a very mean lady put a curse on me." Catalina huffed out a shocked breath. "A curse?" He nodded, and she said, "Tell me about the curse." "I'm doomed to walk the earth, alone and immortal, until my beloved finds me and rescues me." He said it very dramatically because it was, in fact, very dramatic. But the entire story only made him tired anymore. He no longer held much hope that there was an end in sight for him, a return to the ability to love and breathe and sleep, and exist inside this shell of a body that hadn't felt like his in so long. Her voice was soft, teasing but not mocking. "And how will your beloved rescue you?" "Apparently, she will simply see me," he said, staring into his glass. "I see you." He laughed sadly at this, not able to correct her that it meant something very specific. "What did you do to make her curse you?" "I slaughtered a corrupt king's family." It had been so long since he'd said this aloud, the words felt stiff and sharp, cutting his tongue as he spoke them. Her dark eyes went wide. "Oh, that's deep." "Oh, darling, that is only the very tip." He winked, because she hadn't asked, and because he knew, ultimately, he wouldn't be able to say the words even if he wanted to. He'd left out the most important details. Details like how he'd paid for these crimes first by having to watch the murder of his wife, his soul, his beloved. How he'd watched Anora tied to the stake and burned to death. And then he'd been killed too, at least, in a way he had. A sword had been decisively slashed through his heart. His blood had spilled in great pools, staining the palace courtyard. His heart had stopped beating. But as he'd felt the life drain out of him, the king's sorceress had hovered nearby, those long, crooked fingers with twisted black fingernails pointing at his bleeding corpse, as she spoke the curse that kept him alive, but alone to this day. In shadows draped with feathers night. A fallen soul awaits the light. Eternal dusk, your heart's refrain. Break this spell, remove your pain. Immortal chains, your tethered plea. Only when found will you be free. Briggan had stumbled through the next several weeks, his unfamiliar body sore and unwieldy, his devastation and guilt over the loss of his wife as raw and exposed as the festering hole he swore had been put in his torso, but which had immediately sealed up to reveal nothing but a perfect, unmarred chest. He had hurled himself from the top of a cliff, thrown himself in front of a stampede. He had paid a man to shoot an arrow through his neck, swallowed a vial of poison. And nothing had ended his misery. "You shall see her again," a fortune teller had assured him after he dropped 5 stolen coins into her palm, months after Anora's murder and Briggan's subsequent purgatory, when he crawled, disoriented and confused, feeling like he might go out of his head trying to interpret the sorceress's riddle. But it will be many lifetimes before she finds you. So, he'd waited those many lifetimes. First 2, then 3, and after 5 interminable centuries, he had finally given up. Time passed, time that could be measured in generations, where he wandered the world growing increasingly bored and impatient, amassing wealth, bedding women, and feeling nothing but physical sensation, filling his body with every drug and concoction meant to make him forget. Though none of them did, until the very last time he tried to be found, only a handful of decades ago. Moving pictures had been invented, and a tiny well of hope had bubbled up inside him. Briggan had walked into the MGM offices and compelled the security guard to take him to the executive offices. He'd compelled the president's secretary to let him in to see the president. He'd compelled the president of MGM to cast him in his biggest project to date. And so he had. Briggan had acted beautifully, he thought, and Hollywood apparently agreed. He'd been awarded an Oscar. Posthumously, of course, since only 3 months after the film came out to enormous commercial success, Michael Minnow had died. Which is to say that Briggan had faked his own death and vanished back into obscurity, waiting with certainty for that one person to emerge, the one person who would see the film and see him. For decades, he'd gotten scores of passersby stopping him in the street, telling him, "You, sir, has anyone ever told you that you look just like that old actor Michael Minnow?" But for all the millions of humans who had seen the film, no one, not a soul in nearly 70 years, had ever publicly declared, "That is no mortal man." Does no one else see what I see? And he only needed one soul to wonder it aloud, one soul to see him, and the curse would be broken. His heart would shake off the eternal winter and begin to beat. His blood would run hot in his veins. The clock on his life would commence mercifully counting down, the way it was always meant to. He would no longer live forever, but he would never be alone again. "Well, that is a perfect Halloween story," Kat said, bringing him back to the present. "Quite." Briggan drained his drink and set the glass down. He met her eyes. This had been, without question, the best night of his existence. He hadn't heard his own laugh in centuries, and he had to let it all go. "My darling, now is when I leave you." She quickly shook her head. "But I have one question left." Briggan held up 5 fingers, ticking each down one at a time. "How old am I? What powers do I have? What did I try to compel you to do? Am I going to kill you? What manner of monster am I?" Remembering 3 more, he lifted his thumb, index, and middle fingers. "What is this pesky curse? How will my true love rescue me? What did I do that was so naughty a sorceress doomed me to lonely immortality?" That's 8 questions, love. Catalina's hazel eyes flared with frustration. Some of those were follow-ups, or just conversation, or just like, concern for my life. Were they not still questions, my sweet lamb? "You still have 3, she insisted. Briggan stood, dropping a bill on the table. "Ah, but you were right. I asked you 4 when we arrived, so I'll play fair. Come, let's get you home." Chapter 7. She wanted to protest, to argue. But then he offered to walk her back to her apartment, and she immediately agreed. Because under normal circumstances, the walk to the distant tip of Manhattan would take nearly 2 hours, but Kat planned to make it last a good deal longer. She led him all around the streets of the city, weaving up and down blocks and through neighborhoods, and she suspected he knew what she was doing, but he didn't protest. They walked side by side deep into the night, and then she began shivering, and he offered his arm and then his coat, and she spent a perfect couple of hours wrapped in that magical woodsy smell of him, pushing away the knowledge of how devastated she was going to be when he inevitably left her at the door. They talked about everything on the walk. Her childhood, her studies, the car accident she'd been in 2 years before. Her favorite foods and films and books. His life, which had stretched hundreds of years. The daily reality of it was hard for her to fathom, the immensity of what he'd seen, what he'd witnessed. His current circumstances seemed to her both wonderful and sad. He could afford any luxury, but never cared about any of it, unable to share it with anyone. But the closer they got to her building, and the more she learned about this creature she suspected she'd already fallen deeply in love with, the more she wondered whether she'd been wrong about him, whether when he left her at the door, he might very gently close his hands around her neck, quickly and mercifully snuffing everything into darkness. And somehow, Kat couldn't find it in her to push away from him, to attempt to run. Something rooted inside her told her he wouldn't kill her, that he couldn't. Briggan kept breaking his own rules, but none of it seemed to matter. It wasn't possible for him to fall in love, he knew that, but scraping back in time, he recollected it might have felt a bit like this. The desire to walk aimlessly through the night until the light of sunrise shimmered at the edge of the East River. The tentative progress in contact, from his jacket around her shoulders to his hand closing around hers, and then his arm, bringing her body close until it was pressed all along his. And when they reached her place at last, a nondescript East Village building they'd passed at least 5 times already, she slowed and turned to him. "I guess I can't delay it any longer," she said. He smiled. "As you wish." Catalina tilted her face up to him, exposing the long, pale length of her neck. "Do whatever you plan to do. Just know, this has been the most wonderful night of my life." He imagined lifting his hands, wrapping them around the thin, vulnerable column of her throat, and he couldn't, not in a million years. So Briggan bent, resting his lips on her pulse, feeling the life thrumming there, coveting it so deeply it made phantom pain slice through his torso. Catalina lowered her chin, opportunistically capturing his mouth in a kiss, and he couldn't help himself. He groaned, melting into it, calculating whether the pleasure of one night 1 week, 1 lifetime with her was worth the pain of inevitable loss, and he knew he couldn't bear it. She sent her hands up his back, and he bent to taste her, those lips, that soft, teasing tongue, to suck and lick and indulge in this final taste. But as they moved together, the contact deepening into something lush and promising, Briggan became aware of the path of her touch, diverging from the norm. Lovers' hands always passed hungrily from his backside to his shoulders, or the same path in reverse, groping and possessive and entitled. But invariably their fingers would pass, unfeeling, over the site of eruption, the obstacle of powerful muscle and bone and feather extending from his back. Briggan stilled now as Catalina's tentative caresses circled the wide base of his left wing where it joined his taut back muscles, and traveled up over the broad arc of it, gently, seductively, exploring the enormous wind-roughened curve all the way down to the erotic, sensitive, feather-soft tip. He gasped, electrified, his entire body gone rigid. She pulled back to take in his expression, her wonder immediately crashing into remorse. "I'm sorry, I should have asked. I just didn't know if they were real." Thunderstruck mute, he stared down at her and simply nodded, for all around him the world began to melt into color and vibration and sound. Her face, which had been beautiful to him from the moment he saw her, was now something else altogether, still beautiful but now irresistible, dear to him in a way that held her tenderly at the very center of each cell in his body. His life, his love, his soul stood before him. Beneath his sternum, Briggan's heart took a gigantic, thrashing lurch. Heat spiraled down his torso, extending into each limb, pulsing hot into each finger. He sucked a deep breath of icy air into his lungs, reveling in the contrast of warmth inside, cold outside. "If I'd given you another, what was your final question going to be?" he asked her, his voice hoarse with emotion. Catalina looked up at him, her eyes adoring and concerned. "I was going to ask you whether you could fly." He could fly and glide and soar and dive, but right in that moment, with his soul and heart returned to him, with Catalina standing before him and their future spreading out ahead like a vibrant, luxurious tapestry, Briggan could only fall to his knees.